So hi everyone. Welcome to Soup with Substance, Combating, Understanding, Detecting Human Trafficking, the Power of Essential Partnerships. My name is Amanda Harris. I'm the student coordinator for Soup with Substance, and I'd like to welcome you all to Soup with Substance. Soup with Substance is a weekly program that highlights social justice and peacemaking topics over a simple lunch of soup and bread. Since April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month and today is Denim Day, various community partners have come together to host this panel on human trafficking. For those who have joined our call via Zoom, please select the speaker view option in the top right-hand corner and submit your questions for the panelists using the chat box. For the students on the call, we want you to know that Marquette victim advocates can provide immediate and ongoing support for victims of sexual assault, relationship violence, trafficking, stalking, or sexual harassment. The advocates are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and are just a phone call or an email away. Advocacy Services is a confidential resource. Casey Odo and Katie Adler, two campus victim advocates, are here today if you need support. Feel free to send them a message. And today's moderator is John Byrne, who is the Executive Vice President of AML RightSource and a Marquette alumni. He also serves on Marquette's Commercial Baking Board. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited about this. When we first talked to Pat Kennelly and the great work that's going on at the center, I mentioned that one of the things that the human trafficking problem that continues to haunt us all domestically and globally is the only light at the end of the tunnel is the private-public partnership that goes on. There's so much that goes on with the financial sector, with organizations. You're going to hear from Polaris, law enforcement, prosecutors. So we thought what we would do today is give you a sense of both the scope of the problem and some of the things that are going on, and also give you some tips on how you can further engage, hopefully, your communities to deal with this horrific problem. So I'm happy today to have a really exciting panel, and let me introduce them, and then we'll dive right into it. Sarah Crow is the Strategic Initiatives Director for Financial Systems at Polaris. Polaris is an anti-trafficking organization that has been in place since 2002. Tanya Montoya is Director for AML Risk at ACAMS. Tanya and I worked together when I was at ACAMS, and she's spearheaded a lot of the activity on human trafficking in her community and in the workplace. We're going to talk about that. Paul Fry is a detective in Oshkosh, and Paul has been working cases in this space, and we want to get some insight from him on what he's seeing, what the challenges are, and those sorts of things. Erin Cashin is an assistant district attorney, the team captain of the Sensitive Crimes Unit in Milwaukee County. And again, just the importance of understanding that while this is a global problem, it's regional as well. And what can we do as a community to, not improve this, but better combat it, understand it, detect it. And last but not least is my good friend, Rick Small. Rick is head of financial crimes and sanctions at Truist Bank, and in various roles that he's had over time, worked with the financial sector to organize ways in which the financial sector could be better equipped to deal with what we call red flags or indicators of what we think could be potentially listed as human trafficking events. And he's worked a bit on that. And he's going to tell you a bit about what his institution and others are doing. And like I said, at the end of this, we hope we're going to give you more information than you've had before, more encouragement to engage your communities, and hopefully continue to deal with this problem that unfortunately has been, we've been dealing with since, I hate to say, close to the beginning of time. We'll take your questions. Put questions in the chat box. We've extended this an extra 30 minutes because we anticipate there'll be questions and comments. So we're looking forward to engaging everybody. But I'd like to start off first with Sarah Crow. I've been fortunate to work with Sarah for a number of years. Polaris is an amazing institution. I want Sarah to sort of set the stage for the problem of human trafficking, maybe some of the myths about it, what it is and what it's not, and also some of the things that she's learned dealing with the financial sector over the course of the past several years. Sarah, welcome, and really interested in your point of view and your insight.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for joining this session. So I think I'll start by just kind of giving the definition of human trafficking kind of in layman's terms, just so we're all on the same page about what we're talking about here. Really, we're talking about situations in which people are made to work against their will or made to engage in commercial sex, which is more commonly known as prostitution against their will. So these are situations in which people would leave that situation or leave that job if they could, but something's keeping them there. Maybe they're being threatened with something. There has to be some kind of force, fraud, or coercion going on. This also includes situations in which minors, so people under the age of 18, are engaged in prostitution because those are individuals that are too young to consent to this activity. So we're talking about people who are made to do this kind of work when they would not otherwise do so. And I want to kind of highlight that because I think there is some confusion about human trafficking. It often gets confused with the concept of human smuggling, which is a distinct issue. So human smuggling is when somebody is brought into a country and doesn't go through the legal immigration process. They come in illegally. That would be human smuggling. So people who are have experienced human smuggling may also experience human trafficking, but they're distinct. So they're two different crimes there. So that's one thing I'd want to point out. I think another thing to point out is just about where human trafficking is happening. I think, when you first hear about trafficking or learn about the issue, you maybe think this is an issue that's happening in, developing countries, maybe Southeast Asia comes to mind. But really, we're hearing and we know that human trafficking is existing all over the world. So depending on kind of the definition you're using, if you're using the US definition or the international definition, there are estimates that there's about somewhere between 25 million and 40 million victims of human trafficking in the world. That's a challenging estimate to reach because this is a very hidden population, but those are kind of the general sense of the problem. And that is really covering every country, so developed countries and developing economies. And, in the United States, we operate the US National Human Trafficking Hotline. So this is a 24-hour helpline for individuals who, want to get connected with assistance in their community. So whether it's shelter, counseling, or law enforcement assistance, they can reach out to us and we'll kind of make that connection to the organizations working in their community. And through operating that hotline, in the last 13 years, we've heard about more than 70,000 situations of human trafficking, which were occurring in the United States. And really, I would say that's probably the tip of the iceberg because those are only the people that can contact us or know about our hotline. But it's important to know this is happening in all different types of communities. So about 600 of those cases were in Wisconsin. I looked, about 250 of them were in Milwaukee City specifically. And that's, again, just who calls us. And then finally, I would say, human trafficking can look a lot of different ways. And that's one of the reasons it's a really complicated crime. It's very diverse. So, despite my love for the movie Taken, which is a very entertaining film, it has definitely led to some misconceptions about what human trafficking looks like. So people usually talk about human trafficking like it's always this big international organized crime syndicate that's doing it. And that's not the reality. In sex trafficking situations, that may happen. There are organized groups, but there's also individuals that's maybe a boyfriend or a family member of a victim. Or it may be a labor trafficking situation where somebody is on a farm with 500 individuals, or they might be a domestic worker, like a housekeeper, and they're the only person in a private home. So it's a very diverse crime, and it can look very different. And I think that's part of kind of the confusion and the misconceptions is that we're actually talking about kind of a range of different activities here when we're talking about that. And finally, I'll just point out one thing, that the estimate of profit here is it's estimated to be about $150 billion a year industry. So this is a, human trafficking right now is a highly profitable enterprise, and it can often be kind of a low risk venture. So that's something that I think a lot of us are working on, is how do we, make this not almost like a business opportunity to people, and really flip that. So it's not as profitable, and it's a higher risk venture to those that try to hurt others. And so I will pause there.
Sarah, I'm going to come back to you, but I want to ask you one quick follow-up question. Another thing that you've worked on and Polaris has spearheaded is what we characterize as empowering survivors, because many times survivors unfortunately they're unable to get loans and credits. And that, I know that on the House side, there's actually legislation that would deal with impaired credit. Can you just talk a little bit about, it's bad enough to be trafficked, but then when they survive, the survivors have challenges entering back into society financially. And talk a little bit about what Polaris and others are doing there.
Yeah, so trafficking survivors, many different people may experience it, but the people that are kind of most vulnerable often represent other kind of vulnerable populations. So maybe they're from communities of color, or they're migrant populations, or they've had a lot of economic insecurity in their life, and so there's a kind of a lot of factors that when you're leaving a trafficking situation, kind of reaching a place of security and stability, it can be very challenging. And one of the things that comes up a lot is it's very common for a trafficker to utilize the identity of their victim in order to commit money laundering or commit the crime. And so when somebody leaves a trafficking situation, there are times that their trafficker kind of coerce them to take out loans or run out debt. And then when they leave that trafficking situation, that debt is still attached to their identity, not their traffickers. And so that's a whole nother issue of trying to figure out, how do you, repair your credit? How do you kind of get different institutions to understand that, this was really fraud that was carried out in your name. And that's just this additional challenge that is something we're continuing to work on.
Great, thanks.
Hey,
Paul
John.
Fry. Paul Fry's a detective in Oshkosh, and Paul, obviously, I would assume that investigating and tracking human trafficking issues there or over the border in Illinois must be more than simply challenging. Give us a sense of what, as you're doing investigations, what you look for, and how important is it that society hopefully gives the police tips and information. Just walk us through the challenges that you face, I'm sure, every day.
Okay, thanks, John. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so when I refer to the Fox Valley, that's our area. That would be the Fond du Lac, Oshkosh, Appleton, and Green Bay area mainly. And one of the things we see is our area is an economic hub or target from a lot of the traffickers in the Milwaukee area. And I think the best way I can describe it is similar to the drug trade, where in the drug trade, obviously the drugs are the commodity. And in the human trafficking, the female victims, typically by us, they are the commodity. And what we see is, say in Milwaukee, a $10 crack rock can be sold for $40 up our way because of a supply and demand. So it's lucrative. The same thing applies to human trafficking. These traffickers realize quickly that they can make a lot more money up in the Fox Valley area, and we become a regular part of their business, basically. They'll send victims up here, sometimes in hotel rooms for a couple of days at a time, sometimes even just to sit in a car in a Walmart parking lot and respond to calls for the ads that they've posted for the victims. And over time, they start to develop a customer base, and they start to move through the area, maybe Fond du Lac for a couple of days, Oshkosh for a couple of days, up to Green Bay and out to Wausau, and kind of running that circuit. And part of the challenge for us is when we do make a case and say we make an arrest, none of the key players are from this area. The victims aren't, the traffickers aren't. So the trafficker makes bond and leaves the area. We refer the victim to services, but understandably, they want to get back to family in Milwaukee or wherever they're from. So they leave the area. And a lot of times that makes it really hard for us to follow through on a bigger scale. However, what we do see from time to time is we will get contact from the Milwaukee Police Department or the Milwaukee prosecutors that'll say, hey, you remember this case from 2 years ago that you guys did? And we're like, yeah. And they'll be like, well, that victim has disclosed now what's been going on. You know, can we get the phone download? Can we get the police report? Because now it becomes an important part of a much bigger case. So that's a lot of times pretty satisfying for us when we can be part of a bigger prosecution like that.
So to Sarah's point earlier, the stats show that it's not as organized. Do you see sort of a hybrid that some of it is, as you say, they're from out of state, out of county? It is, there are some organized, I don't know, criminal groups or whatever doing this, as well as individuals. What's your sense of that, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we see major organizations, but we do see an individual that may have 2 or 3 victims under his control, and he'll get them up here and just start to collect the profits from them. Sometimes it's as simple as, you know, he sits outside in the car and takes the cash out of her hand, and immediately she comes out the door. Other times we're seeing the money quickly transferred, you know, through things like Venmo, you know, these quick cash apps and things like that. And it may only be, you know, $200, $300, $400 a day, but it's this constant grind, and that really adds up. So,
what sort of training? Obviously, detectives and police in general get a lot of training in all different types of crimes. What sort of training was important to you to follow the money and do this? Is it tangential to or adjacent to some other types of crime? You know, I think about the example we learn in the financial sector is if 2 people walk into an institution and the one person is doing all the talking, setting up the account, that could be elder abuse. It could be human trafficking, right? Somebody who's intimidating the other person. What sort of training is essential for you folks to stay on top of all these things? Is, like I said, is it just simply following the money, or is it much broader than that?
So just quickly on training, initially there was no training when we started this, you know, back. And Milwaukee PD was actually very helpful because we were able to communicate with them and get a better understanding. You know, since then you're seeing a lot more of these 3-day conferences, you know, at the Dells where they cover all these different topics. And that's been extremely helpful. And, you know, a lot of the hotel interdiction kind of cues, the things you're talking about, you know, a male that seems to be totally in control, a female that doesn't look up, isn't allowed to speak, all those kind of cues we've been able to kind of get out to the community. And I think that's been pretty helpful.
Well, that's great. I'm going to go back to Sarah in a little bit about additional training ideas. But Aaron, I want to turn to you. You know, part of I'm assuming part of the challenge and struggle here is when you're bringing cases, you know, prosecuting human trafficking, you could prosecute, as Sarah mentioned, you can prosecute money laundering and, you know, some other statutes perhaps. But part of it, tell us, is the challenge reluctant witnesses, intimidation? Walk us through, if you can, a typical prosecution and what you need to make, in general, to make a good case for human trafficking.
Well, thanks. There are a lot of challenges to human trafficking cases. Traffickers are frequently exceptionally manipulative, and they exploit the vulnerabilities that victims have, if it's a trauma history, if it's a drug and alcohol issue, or any other vulnerabilities. So they exploit all of those vulnerabilities and use it to their advantage. They instill from day one in the victim that the police are not their friends, that the police are going to arrest them, right, get them in trouble. And prostitution is still legal, so they do have a lot of contact with police where they are getting arrested, so that it instills and reinforces what the trafficker is saying, that the police are not to be trusted. So it really takes a lot of communication. It takes a lot of intersection with different systems to be able to bring a case forward. It takes a lot of training from the police on how to talk to people and how to talk to victims in a non-judgmental, open way to start to rebuild that trust so that the victims can disclose on what the defendants have done to them. But I think human trafficking, more than any other crime, has so many different intersections with our different systems. I mean, just like Detective Fry was saying, we're training hotels to look for signs. I've trained nurses and doctors on what to look for signs, the banking institutions, what signs to look for in human trafficking, because we can bring all of those witnesses together and help corroborate what the victim has told us. So human trafficking, more than any other crime, really requires a village. And when we do have a cooperative victim, when we do have a victim who's ready to leave the life, you have to remember that it's not just the criminal justice system that's going to assist her. The trafficker has made her dependent on him for everything, for clothing, for money, for shelter, for emotional support. So helping that victim get out of that life means helping her with all of those aspects of her life to assist her to be able to transition away. So she's not just relying on one person for all of those job skills, for the food, for money to, go to the grocery store, have her hair done, her nails done. It is trying to get her out of that life means recognizing that he fulfilled a huge portion of her life and of her support, and acknowledging that, and then getting her assistance to have that support found elsewhere in her life. I do think it's important to note that we usually default to pronouns of a male trafficker and a female victim. There are male victims, there are female traffickers, but just for ease, we usually default to that. But I just wanted to kind of point that out as well.
As I asked Detective Fry, what about training? Obviously, as a prosecutor, you have to figure out a lot of different laws and issues. What was most helpful to you, besides the obvious, communication, all the things that you've outlined? But what was most helpful to you? Because it seems to me that while Sarah mentioned entertainment like Taken, it's much more nuanced and much more not black and white, gray in this space. So what was helpful to you as a prosecutor to hopefully enable you to do additional prosecutions in this space, or just to improve the environment?
I think any training that is multidisciplinary can really help. When we can bring together those detectives, when we can bring together our medical personnel, the financial institutions, the hotels, and the technology. These cases are so dependent on technology these days because ads are placed on the internet. There are all of these ways to transfer money over the internet, whether it's Cash App or Venmo or PayPal, or just Apple Pay, and learning how to find those records, how to introduce those records into court. But really, a multidisciplinary training is the best approach to human trafficking, because it's not just going to be me and Detective Fry. It's going to be, the hotel records, the phone records, the medical personnel, where she maybe had a broken arm 3 years ago, and bringing those records in. And I will say, human trafficking, of all of the topics that I train on, is one where I've really been asked to train a lot of different, not just law enforcement, but going out to the hotels, truckers against trafficking has been huge in training, detectives, medical personnel. So it really is, it just impacts so many different issues in life that you wouldn't expect. So it's not just the police, it's not just the DA's office, but it really takes all of these people working together to make a case come together.
That's so important, Erin, especially being more aware. And so, like you say, there's so many different elements that can enable this. And the truckers, that's an interesting one. I know that Polaris has worked with those organizations as well, and we'll come back to that. So I want to shift gears and bring in Rick Small, because we want to talk a little bit about the financial sector. But let me premise it this way. About ballparking here, about 10 years ago, I was working with Tanya, who you'll hear from in a couple of minutes, at ACAMS. And we were hearing from the banks, basically from the mid-level, bottom level up. So it wasn't necessarily senior managers, but it was people that lived in these various communities who said, we're seeing more and more evidence of trafficking, and we want to do something. And at that time, there really wasn't an approach by the financial sector to look for certain things. If they saw something that was suspicious, it sort of had to have a financial crime component to it, right? So what we ended up doing with Rick's leadership is we put a bunch of bankers analysts together with, at that time, Department of Homeland Security analysts. They sort of went off and they came up with a series of indicators, red flags that they believed could be indicators of human trafficking. So a quick example would be transactions after midnight, credit card transactions in even numbers, that sort of thing, which today seems obvious, but at the time it was, oh, okay, that could actually happen. And they took all that information and published it more broadly to the entire financial community. And people became much more aggressive and proactive in looking for, again, potential, you never know exactly, but potential human trafficking and reporting that to the government. So again, it hasn't been going on for 20 years, but it's gone on for at least a decade, and you can always get better at this. And we'll come back to Sarah in a little bit on how we can get better in this. But Rick, maybe take it from there. So, I know you heard from your staff and you and others that just said, we need to do more, and more has happened. Obviously, nothing's perfect, but it's a really good example, I think, of staffs making the case to their leadership. There's some things we can do here that perhaps we hadn't done before. So walk us through some of that. You were at a different institution at the time, but I know your current institution is pretty engaged in this as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. And just to finish out that story, John, one of what amazed me when we did that project, where we put our analysts in the room with law enforcement and looked at some live cases, not the institution I was with, but another very large institution that's got a footprint across the country, actually was able to identify, based on some information that we got from law enforcement, a pattern where you would see usually women enter the country, for example, on the West Coast, and then you would see a series of hotel payments, rental car payment, gas purchase, moving across the country in a short period of time. And what we learned from that, again, working with law enforcement, was these women were being brought into the country, sometimes illegally, and they were being transported across the country to be used for.
You're on mute, Rick.
Have I been on mute the whole time?
No, just the last 20 seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So that's kind of weird. Anyhow, what we saw was this pattern where the women were being brought into the country, being transported across the country. We learned from law enforcement that they did not want, the bad guys did not want to put these women on public transportation and trains, on planes, things like that. And so you could see that progression, which was super interesting. And this bank was actually able to identify more activity after that. Coming back to your question though, John, from a bank perspective, I look at it in three areas we're focused on. So we absolutely want to try and train up our frontline staff to identify instances where we see victims when they come into one of our branches. That doesn't happen as much as one would think, but to your point about elder abuse, we train our staff up on looking for indicators of abuse in any way and flag that. We also want to make use of all of the transactional data we have and the technology that we may be able to put against it to see if we can identify patterns and typologies to look at and say, these transactions appear to be related to human trafficking as opposed to these transactions that might not be, so that we can flag those for law enforcement. And we have had some success with that. And then the third area, and this is something that I've worked on with Sarah and would like to see more of, we've been trying to help survivors, just to Sarah's point, about getting back into the economy. So in a few instances, we've been able to open up some bank accounts for survivors, provide them with a limited amount of credit so that they can actually build their credit back up. And in some instances, and those that are engaged in the banking world as we are would know, there are very specific requirements, for example, for identification of a customer, which we've had to figure out ways to maneuver around that, because some of these victims and now survivors were brought into the country illegally, so they don't have the same status. So those are sort of the three areas that we've been focusing on.
Thanks, Rick. I want to bring in Tanya Montoya. Tanya and I work together, and she's still there at ACAMS. ACAMS, for those of you that don't know, it's the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. It's an 80,000 plus member organization, global organization that does training and conferences and programming in this space and many others. And what I wanted to chat with Tanya about, she's worked on this issue in a couple of different fashions. And one is, I want her to give us a sense of how you can start an initiative with your own employees. So how do you put something together internally, no matter how big or small your organization is? And what are the, not hurdles, but what do you have to make sure that you do? Because once you say you want to do something proactively against trafficking, no one's going to say they don't want to participate. But how do you put it together? So Tanya, give us a sense of how that's worked for you, both at ACAMS, but also you've worked with other organizations as well.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for having me today. So I think part of it is we all want to do something. We all feel almost helpless in a situation like this, and in our environments, whether it's at work and your school environment, we're always thinking, what can I do to make a difference? And that's the approach that ACAMS took years ago, referencing what John spoke about. What can we do as an organization, and how can that impact our employees? So as a staff member for ACAMS, really it was about, let's build awareness internally first, right? So there were three major goals that we wanted to accomplish, and that was to build awareness inside the organization, staff becoming aware, becoming more involved in the fight against human trafficking. And then the next objective was training awareness for our membership community. So at the time, we probably had, 10,000 members. Now we're 80,000+. But definitely making sure that as an organization, we were also including training and awareness in our conferences, at our webinars, and bringing the financial sector and the financial industry together, the community, to help us forge ahead with the training and the awareness. And then lastly, partnering with the community and partnering with organizations, whether locally, nationally, internationally, and really all this originated from starting a fight against human trafficking committee for the employees. So we really truly worked together, ground floor, ground up, a grassroots approach, set it up through our human resources department. So those of you that are at different organizations, really, it's a matter of speaking up, right? And going to your leadership at your employer, setting up a committee of volunteers. And staff was always willing and able to help. We joined a local organization in Miami, Florida, Christie House, and they are an advocacy center for victims of child sexual abuse. So that definitely parlayed into many other activities and joint partnerships. We then joined Polaris, the organization, as a Freedom Circle member, and that's how we started working with Sarah many years ago. So it really is about just taking action as an individual, as an employee. We also joined the Human Trafficking Task Force down in South Florida, and Milwaukee has one. There are many different task forces around the country that you can look up and then see about joining as a community partner.
Hey, Aaron, you mentioned before, thanks, Tanya. Aaron, you mentioned before working again with financial sector, hotels, truckers. Is it an informal group? Is it a task force, however you want to define that? Or is it just you have these contacts and you're able to reach out to them? Does it need to be more formal, or is it working fine the way you're doing it?
Well, we do have a task force, but our task force is law enforcement specific. So
Okay.
We have a task force where the Milwaukee Police Department works with the FBI and other local jurisdictions such as West Dallas and some other communities to work on cases together and have a law enforcement task force. I do know that the Milwaukee Police Department has worked very closely in conjunction with our community prosecutors out of the DA's office to work with the hotels in the area. I don't know if it's a formal task force, but there's definitely a free flow of information and a relationship that's been built there where we've done specified training for hotels. I think the Truckers Against Trafficking is its own organization that has worked collaboratively with us in the past. So one giant task force, I don't think we have one,
Right.
but we do have a lot of different relationships that we've built over the years, especially the police department working with our community prosecutors. And for those of you who don't know, the district attorney's office has community prosecutors that are stationed in the police district that are working with initiatives for community involvement and community relations. So they're a huge component to building those relationships with hotels and with other community organizations to promote human trafficking awareness.
So if somebody watching today that's local, that's not involved in any of this, you know, they work for a hotel, they work for a bank, whatever, is there a website they can go to? Should they reach out to your office? What would you recommend that they do?
I would recommend that they reach out to their local police district, especially if they're in Milwaukee. There are 7 different police districts. It asks to speak to the community to the community prosecution unit. There are usually officers that are specifically assigned to that unit that work closely with the district attorney assigned to that district. And they can give them any resources they want. Sensitive crimes in the DA's office also works closely with the community prosecutors. So we can all work together to collaborate on any needs that the community would have.
I should have asked you this up front, but does Wisconsin have anti-trafficking a criminal statute?
We do. We have 2 different criminal human trafficking statutes. One that is specific for children. So there's trafficking of a child. And then there's one that's specific for adults, just in 2 different parts of the statute book. And that's the one that Sarah mentioned earlier with force, fraud, or coercion. We also have a couple of changes to the law that happened in the last couple of years. One of them moved our felony pandering statute into the human trafficking statute. So it's just a subsection of human trafficking. And pandering is the kind of simple definition is anybody who is transporting a prostitute or someone for a commercial sex act and then is obtaining money after the fact. So maybe there isn't force, fraud, or coercion, but they're definitely transporting, recruiting. So we have a couple of different options in our statutes. And then they're Class C felonies. So one of our highest felonies.
Okay, great, thanks. A question came in, Rick, I'm going to give to you. It says, what system or program are you using to cross-reference victims or services county to county? Because you were talking before about transportation and all that. Are there high level, are there systems? So how do you get the data that you look at?
So the data we get, that we look at is data that we have from our own transactions.
Okay.
I looked at that question more about either to Erin or Paul or Sarah in terms of sharing information across jurisdictions.
Sarah, did you hear that?
Yes. I guess my question would kind of be, depends on who's involved in the information sharing. So, you know, law enforcement has their own mechanisms for sharing information across jurisdictions. I mean, we try to be extremely careful with our use and our sharing of any information that would pertain to a victim. That is information that's really, really confidential. You know, there's a lot of security concerns, and a lot of times those victims report to us in confidence. So I'm not sure the best answer there, but I think it depends a little bit on the situation and who's involved.
Sure, and we've tried working with you folks, Sarah, to figure out ways of information sharing, and there's obviously some hurdles and some issues. So it's something we the anti-money laundering community struggle with, is how best can we share information. So I think that's always going to be a continued challenge. But there's another question in here, Sarah. I'm going to go to you, but someone is saying that Ohio is one of the worst areas for trafficking from their perspective. Is there any useful resources that we can use to spot human trafficking? And before you answer that, what's interesting about that comment is when our project started 10 years ago, it really emanated from Columbus, Ohio bankers who at the time worked for JP Morgan, and they went to senior management and said, it's unbelievably problematic in this state. What can we do? So I just remember that was one of the first groups of bankers that sort of raised their hands and said we should do more. But what would be your recommendation? And maybe it's broader than just Ohio residents, but what would you suggest?
Okay, so one thing to note here is I have heard from many different states, many different cities that there's information suggesting they are at the epicenter of human trafficking. Having spent a lot of time looking at the data, I don't know that those hotspots are necessarily as significant as sometimes they're being portrayed, because oftentimes what's happening is you're looking at a data set of where information was reported, which might actually be indicating that in that community, people know how to report and know where to call to ask for help. And so sometimes when you're seeing a high number of cases from an area, it's actually a reflection that the community is doing a really good job educating its population on what to look for and who to contact, not necessarily that they have more trafficking than another location. In my experience, the majority of trafficking hotspots are just the places with the largest populations in the United States. If there are humans there, there may be human trafficking there. So that's one thing to note. But for everyone's reference, our organization, Polaris, again, we operate this hotline. So if you go to humantraffickinghotline.org, on that site, there is a referral directory, and it is a list of organizations in different communities throughout the country. It's not all of the organizations that we're aware of, but the ones that we're comfortable being on this website. And so that's a really good source of information if you're interested in volunteering in your community, of some organizations to reach out for. And then I would also say, in terms of what to look out for, I think one thing that's really important to remember, there are certain professions that are maybe at a higher likelihood to identify trafficking than others. So we've obviously been talking about banking. I think the medical profession has been extremely important in identifying trafficking victims in particular. Educators, there's certain professions there. But for the average citizen, you may not look across a room and see, something that's a trafficking situation. It is a little more complex than that. So I think one of the most important things that everyone can do is really check in on the people in their life. So your friends, your sister, your brother, the people in your life, and see how they're doing. It's very, in many situations, human trafficking can be very interconnected with domestic violence. So if somebody is in a relationship that seems, very controlling or abusive, do you ever take the moment to say, hey, are you doing okay? I'm kind of worried about you. It seems like, things might be a little bit tough. Is there anything I can do to support you? That's something that all of us can do. And it's something that, during the pandemic, I've worried about, as we're not having as many of those interactions with the people in our life. Are those conversations and those chances to kind of reach out and ask, are you okay, happening? So that's something I hope everyone will kind of keep in mind with, those in their family and their friends and those around them.
Yeah, I remember you were talking a lot about the pandemic sort of amplifying people being distant and more difficult to track this. So your simple point about just communicating with people makes a ton of sense. We have a comment from submitted on Facebook Live. It says, as a person with a valid commercial driver's license, all commercial drivers are obligated to report suspicious activity and behaviors, similar to obviously what the financial sector does. Paul, I'm going to come back to you for a bit and ask, as you're doing these investigations, what's important in terms of tips from the community? So, obviously, as we become more aware, we see things. Hopefully, we're providing you with good information. But when you're investigating cases, I won't say how useful are tips. I assume there's some value there. But what would be your recommendation if somebody wanted to get information to you because they think they've seen an example of trafficking, and they obviously would like to see some follow-up by law enforcement.
Yeah, and you're right. Most of the things we uncover is really through self-initiated activity when we'll run operations. And then as a result of those operations, make arrests, gather evidence. But as far as any tips that come in, like anything else, the more specific, the better. License plate numbers, anything specific. And it really helps if there's someone we can actually call back and talk to, as opposed to just an anonymous tip. Here's the information, and that's it. We can still keep these people anonymous, but it really helps us to talk to somebody that really witnessed these events or these people. And, you know, with that firsthand account, we typically get a lot more useful information that way than, say, just an anonymous Crime Stopper tip, and that's it.
Yeah, Paul, I don't know if you saw this, but a question came in relevant to your point. It said, when a victim comes forward revealing necessary information, how is he or she protected? So, you know, obviously they're going to be providing personal details and all that. Obviously, you don't have to tell us the intricacies of the Oshkosh police, but just in general, how do law enforcement make sure, like you say, firsthand accounts is best, victim accounts would appear to be even better? How do you, have that person trust that whatever they tell you is not going to get back to the trafficker, that sort of thing? Again, just high level, what's the process for protecting information?
Yeah, and I think Aaron could probably offer a great answer to this.
Sure.
So we do a lot to try and protect the victim information. We do have Marcy's Law in Wisconsin, we also have Chapter 950, which is victims' rights. We've had that for quite some time to protect their identifying information. I think the best thing we do is we really, there are some tools that law enforcement has. There's also the safety planning and our community partners and our community advocates that can help, maybe with housing or job placement, things to get her back up on her feet to where she has a different support network so that the trafficker can't quite get to her. I would also say, just going back to Detective Fry's comment earlier about the tips, I would encourage people not to get discouraged just because the police aren't acting on it right away, or doesn't appear to the person who's giving the tip that the police are acting on it right away. It doesn't mean that it is forgotten. As Detective Fry mentioned earlier, we are frequently going back to corroborate what the victim has told us, and we'll go back years. So, that tip that someone called in maybe in 2016, it's documented, it's kept somewhere, and then you never know, a couple of years later, you might get a call that you're needed to testify, or that nurse who took a report about a broken arm 6 years ago, with an appropriate medical release, we might call and say, we need you to testify about those injuries. So I would encourage people not to get frustrated or discouraged if it appears that nothing's happening. Oftentimes, this is a process for the victim. She'll have those intersections with people and those interactions, but it will take a while for her to be ready to disclose all of her victimization. But documenting it, calling the police, or all those other documentation can come in handy and can be huge for trials later in life. So.
Tanya, I know that you talked about some of the programs and conferences and seminars, webinars that ACAMS and others have done to, explain this issue to various practitioners. I also know, because it was the time that I was still working with you, that we had an event in Toronto and we had a survivor speak to the audience. And what resulted from that was amazing. So not only was the presenter, super personal and explained what had occurred and just gave a lot of good information, but right after that, the bankers in the audience, and these were Canadian banks, said, what else can we do, right? And so they immediately, and you'll appreciate this, Aaron and Paul, they worked together with the mounted police and other organizations in Canada and created something called Project Protect. And so if you Google that, you'll see it's been on for a couple of years now, and it's sort of another version of, Aaron, of what you've talked about here. So I thought that was particularly compelling, and that was a reaction to hearing from a survivor. So Tanya, my question to you in general, I know we've used people, survivors before to speak. In terms of people going through our programs, what's the value? The obvious value is to hear what we can do differently. but I know ACAMS has done a couple of programs where they've interviewed people like that. Just walk us through some of that. And I know that you have put together a certificate program so people can actually get a certificate in anti-trafficking. So you don't have to sell it right now, but just high level, because I think that's a really important outcome. And I would argue, based on all the people that you've brought in to these programs that we've heard from, we said we have to do more than simple awareness. Let's do some extensive training.
That's right, John. So when we initially started, I mean, certifications and certificates, which is our bread and butter, that's not something we were contemplating at the time, but we were being asked more and more, not just in the US, but across the globe, on what could be done in terms of a certification program or certificate program. So we partnered up with entities, even including the United Nations and United Nations University, to help us craft a certificate program. And we created 2 different programs. One was free to the community at large. So there is one that is foundational, and those are the foundational principles that everyone really should become familiar with on how to recognize human trafficking, whether it's sex trafficking, labor trafficking. I mean, there's so many varieties that it's not just tied to sex trafficking. So that's important to note. And also knowing that labor trafficking is actually even larger than sex trafficking, so on a global scale. We created also a paid certificate program, of course, that is more in depth for financial institutions who are on the lines every day looking to detect and prevent this type of activity. But really, going back to what we said earlier, partnering with these type of organizations. So the UN also has a program through the United Nations University FAST, and that's something that ACAMS has worked with as well. So if, for those of you in the audience, take a look at it. It's called FAST, and it's sponsored by the United Nations University. That's something that you can find information on. Really, there's so much out there, and it's just great to see this group who started working together many, many years ago, now how much it's grown.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tanya. Rick, I don't know if you see this question. I'm going to go through it. It's a bank-related question. I'm struggling in Milwaukee in a situation in which a minor victim has gone to a bank and withdrawn money from an account by providing, quote, adequate ID, unquote. The bank is declining to call police when the minor shows up with adult men. I'm sorry, it's hard to read this whole thing. I don't know if you can see the whole question there.
Yeah, no, I got the whole question.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. My chat box is
yeah.
Anyway,
I mean, that's kind of difficult. I mean, again.
Well, why don't you rehash the question and go ahead.
So it appears that the bank is declining to call police when the minor shows up with adult men, even though this has happened before and aware of the situation. The bank states the account holder must press charges. That hasn't helped when the bank could call the police when the people are at the bank. So couple things here, and in light of a lot of what's going on in the country today, banks are reluctant to call the police without having a clear understanding of what's going on. And I can't speak for the bank in this instance, but I would suggest that I'm not sure that this is the bank's obligation. It certainly is not the customer's obligation. I mean, I'm not sure I understand why the bank would be saying the customer has to do something. I mean, if this appears to be a victim in the sense that we're talking about it, then anybody can make the call to the police and raise the concern. I'm not sure what the thought is that the bank has some specific information that no one else has.
Erin, do you have any comments on that one? Did you see the question?
I did see the question, and I don't know the banking system, but I almost wonder how much it could be documented. And so, she came in, this underage girl came in with these 2 adult men and maybe a brief description. And if that could be added to the account so that in the future, if the police were to go back with a search warrant or subpoena, that information could be obtained. I can understand the hesitancy for calling the police because while it looks suspicious, they're not entirely sure, like Rick said, that there might be a crime happening. And maybe there is, maybe there isn't. And I can understand the bank maybe not wanting the police in their lobby frequently, but I just wonder how much there's like an ability to make a note for that to happen. But if it's happening over and over, you'd think that they would want to report it
Right.
to somebody.
Yeah, I agree with that last point. If it's happening frequently, bankers have been trained to report. There's no downside of reporting a suspicious activity report in that situation. You got another question, Aaron. How prevalent is trafficking on college campuses in general?
In general, I do think it happens. I think it happens maybe in a little bit of a different form than, what we see pictured in movies, or maybe not as street prostitution or street trafficking. But I do think there are definitely people who are on the college campus who are maybe posting online, who are using different websites, being trafficked through more of an internet-based prostitution and trafficking ring, especially when they might have more ability to travel maybe outside their campus or outside of the state. So I do think it's happening. I can't think of a case right now that has been charged out of a college campus, but I am confident that it is happening. I think it is, my anecdotal opinion is that it would be much more internet-based than street level.
Sarah, do you have any metrics on that as well?
Metrics are always tough. I know a few human trafficking survivors personally that work professionally in the anti-trafficking field that were recruited as college students, including I think at least 2 that were recruited on a college campus. So I think that does happen. I would agree with Aaron. One of the things I've seen lately, is this concept of sugar dating. And so describing prostitution as kind of more of like a benefactor style relationship, like somebody is like the sugar daddy. And I've seen a number of advertisements kind of trying to recruit college students specifically into sugar dating, which, if somebody is doing that consensually and they're an adult, that's one thing. I think my concern is always that situation can escalate and can be a very exploitative situation and then end up being a sex trafficking situation. So that's just something that comes to mind specifically around college students having kind of been targeted for these like sugar dating arrangements.
Right. Sarah, you had mentioned we did.
John,
go ahead, Rick. Sorry, go ahead.
But Mary, who asked the original question, added some more information, which I think for me clarifies it. So the additional comment is that the account holder, which I'm assuming is the minor, has disclosed to the bank the situation. So in that instance, I mean, if somebody is telling somebody else in the bank that they are a victim, there are issues, they've got concerns, absolutely the bank should be escalating that. And hard for me to answer why the bank wouldn't be doing that. I would be very distressed if in my bank this wasn't escalated to the appropriate places so that we could address it.
Thanks for that, Rick. Sarah, I want to go back to you. You've talked also about online exploitation, and one of these questions came in as sort of relevant to that. Has the great increase, must be a website called OnlyFans, content online impacted investigation or impacted human trafficking? So I'll ask both Sarah what her thoughts are, and Aaron, I don't know if you're aware of that site at all, but Sarah, I'll start with you.
Yes. So we actually recently did a very comprehensive review of our hotline statistics and have seen a pretty significant increase in what we call online sexual exploitation being reported to us. So that's situations in which, someone, either it's child sexual abuse materials, kind of more commonly referred to as child pornography being distributed, or it's an adult who is being coerced or forced to participate in like pornographic in creating pornographic content and then that being distributed. And that content goes out through a number of different platforms, but OnlyFans is one that has become increasingly common since the start of the pandemic. So we saw some kind of decreases in reports of what I would call more traditional sex trafficking situations involving kind of in-person prostitution, but we saw about a 45% increase in situations of online sexual exploitation. And there are a number of platforms, but OnlyFans is one that, you know, we only heard of sporadically prior to the pandemic and now hear about quite consistently.
Erin, any thoughts on that, on online exploitation?
I think I agree with Sarah that the online exploitation is drastically on the rise. There are a couple of different ways that can happen. You know, people performing on a webcam without their consent, but also that video can be maybe distributed without that person's consent. Right. And so we're seeing it from a lot of different avenues, not just OnlyFans, but other websites as well. Or, you know, and we're seeing a huge increase in things such as revenge pornography and just capturing intimate representations without people's consent. So it can happen kind of on a multitude of different platforms in a multitude of different ways. I mean, you never know who's on the other side of that webcam, and if there's another person that's forcing that victim to perform, or if that video is being taken and then distributed non-consensually.
So I'll ask for takeaways in a little bit. Someone wants to know what would be the one change, but Sarah, I want to go back to you again on this topic. Polaris has talked about how some of these front companies for human trafficking, and they could be massage parlors, nail salons. You know, there's a certain entities, and sometimes local law enforcement or whatever the agency that's in charge will close these entities, shut them down. But then in some states, in some counties, they open up again, sometimes in the same building, because the rules regarding not incorporation but licensing are so faulty. And I know that Polaris was initially engaged in a project to try to address that, but it's so amorphous and it's such a problem around the country. But give us a sense of that part of this. So again, businesses getting closed down, they're illegal businesses to begin with, right? And then they reopen, but they reopen pretty quickly. And so they're still continuing to do the same activity because, again, the city, the county, the town doesn't have strict licensing overview requirements. So I know you guys identified this a couple of years ago. How prevalent is it still? And what are your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this definitely shows up in kind of those trafficking situations that are more organized and more networked. And, you know, to me, when I see a business that's being kind of shut down and then reopening, I'm generally thinking, okay, the case might have shut down like the managers or the people that are kind of there on the day-to-day. It probably didn't really reach the ultimate beneficial owners of that kind of network. And that can be really challenging to ascertain, as many of us know, considering, you know, people might put certain information on the business records and not others. And so I would say that's a ongoing issue. I think that's very much why the work with the financial services industry is so significant, because ultimately, you know, it is trying to take that more of an organized crime approach where you're trying to identify really the head of the network rather than kind of the discrete people that are maybe on the ground, more operationalizing it. And that's where, you know, following the money, who is ultimately profiting from this enterprise, because often it isn't the people that are the managers, it's somebody else, or it's maybe, you know, there are different kind of professionals that might be involved in like facilitating that network. So that's where I think between the kind of interest, enthusiasm, and work being done in the financial services industry, and then kind of the conversations that are happening within law enforcement about, you know, really trying to take this organized crime approach, I'm hopeful that we're going to start shifting that and see a little bit less of that kind of whack-a-mole type approach.
Anybody else on the panel have thoughts about that particular issue? The ability of these basically criminal enterprises to reopen. Again, I obviously, Aaron, I'm not familiar with Wisconsin law or city and county law, but is this anything that you've seen?
We do see it. I think most commonly it would be in like Asian massage parlors that are performing illegal activities. We have been working with law enforcement to investigate those, and those are, that's a multi-layer approach. Is there trafficking going on where women are being forced to work in the Asian massage parlors? Or is it, what kind of exact criminal activity is going on? But I agree with what Sarah said, that we're looking for, the head of that enterprise,
Right.
So that we can go after the person who's making the most money off of other people.
All right, so we have some time left. Anybody has additional questions, but what I'd like to do is go to each of the panelists and get a takeaway or two. I think you've gotten some really good information today, hopefully some good resources that you can tap, create your own groups, committees, task forces, whatever, support centers. Obviously, as you've learned, it's a multifaceted problem and challenge. And depending on where you come from in terms of your industry, there's much to do. So a question for Rick comes up before I go to everybody. When a person comes into a bank and open a business account, are they required to provide a business charter? You're on mute again.
Darn, thanks for catching that. So it depends. So we have some specific requirements by regulation to identify our customers. Specifically a business charter, not required, but some information around what the business is required. And in a lot of instances, you may know there may not be a business charter. So you have a lot of what we would refer to as legal entities today that don't have business charters and have no requirement to do so. We do though, and this gets back to Sarah's point a little bit. We do have newer requirements to identify the beneficial owners of certain legal entities, not all of them. And the hope there has been that this will at least provide some additional information to law enforcement should they be interested in trying to get behind the legal organization to the individuals involved.
Thanks, Rick. I'm going to go to the panel. Paul, I'm going to start with you. What changes in the environment, laws, regs, support could help you be more successful in investigating human trafficking cases? What would you like to see happen if that's not already happening?
I think one of the biggest keys for us is information sharing. Like I said, we've had a lot of great relationships with different investigators in the Milwaukee area, and that has really been helpful to turn somewhat to us or just a routine small time case and see it connect to something much larger. The other issue that we haven't really talked about a ton is the demand side and trying to limit that and do what can be done there. To talk about the Asian massage parlors, we have a couple in town now. One we've shut down multiple times, but we see cars from all over the state show up here for a massage, literally from hours away, their license plates are coming from. So that's another big component. It's that whole demand for these type of services.
That's an excellent point. We've started to see in the past few years, billboards, information at truck stops, in airports, but you need more than that. So that's an excellent point, Paul. Thanks for all that you do. Tanya, let me go to you. Obviously, ACAMS has done a lot of programming, articles. What additional information, what additional support would make sense from your standpoint? And are there resources that ACAMS has that people could take a look at that could make them better informed here?
Sure. So I think one is, especially in the area of sex trafficking, hearing everybody on the panel makes me just remind myself to always take a look at the victim-based approach, right? Especially in the area of sex trafficking. And once we get ourselves into that frame and that lens of how we view things, it makes it easier, more compassionate approach, so that we're involved at a level that maybe normally we would walk away from. In doing so, I would say look at Polaris's website, the national hotline information. That's heavily, so much information on topologies, red flags, both for institutions and for the consumer. There's a lot of research there, as well as, of course, on ACAM's website. We do have information on our resources, documentation at our conferences, at our webinars. We have some of the panelists here today that present as well for more training purposes. But certainly your local organizations, there are quite a few NGOs across the nation that need the support. Christie House in particular, they're an advocacy center, and there's plenty of those in the area of sex trafficking and child sexual abuse that you can look into in order to support. So just welcome everybody to kind of take that approach and see what they can do both at their school level, at the institutional level, at their employer. Reach out to HR.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Erin, you've given us a lot of good information for the folks in the region. What else would both not make your job easier, but make you more successful in dealing with this horrific crime?
Well, the resources to be able to assist victims with their multi-layers of trauma, I think is always a benefit. More aftercare support for them, such as housing, some job share programs, I think would always help the victim. And then I think when they have that support and can get out of the life, then that helps them to be able to participate in the criminal justice system. If I could real quick, I did see that Jennifer had a question about the legal system. Do I have
Go
time
ahead.
to answer
Yeah,
that?
please. Yeah, please
Okay.
do.
I do think that the law enforcement is recognizing the difference between street independent prostitution and human trafficking. Whenever they're doing stings, they're involving lots and lots of planning, but we're also looking for the trafficker, because we are much more interested in the trafficker than in the street level independent prostitution. I would also note that the legal system as a whole, there are a couple of different initiatives to try and vacate prostitution convictions. So we work closely with some of our NGOs and legal system partners to help get petitions into court to have those prostitution cases vacated, so reopen and have that conviction removed, to better assist victims later in life, such as with housing, with credit checks, anything that's going to look at a criminal record when it's actually a trafficking situation. So we've kind of grown from what we've learned, and we're going back and trying to, in those trafficking situations, vacate those convictions. So I think law enforcement and all of our community partners, like Detective Fry said, working together to recognize trafficking and help assist victims is really kind of the trend right now, and really what's the movement is for. So I think those are all positive things that are coming out of just the light that's finally being shown on the human trafficking problem.
So Rick, obviously partnering is essential, right? That's
absolutely.
hopefully learned that extensively today. What other thoughts besides what you've shared with us so far?
Yes, so absolutely on the partnerships. And, for financial institutions, we're somewhat in this unique position of most of the time, we're not going to see things happen until after they happen. So a lot of our review of transactional activity, which we try and do to see if we can find bad conduct, doesn't happen until after the transactions occur. So one of the things that we've been working on is, John, as you know, and you sort of mentioned early on, you and I worked with Sarah and her organization to try and get a safe harbor so that organizations like Sarah's could provide leads to financial institutions on bad actors, because then we can get out in front and we can look for the bad actors. We had a little bit of progress. We got it through the House, if I remember correctly, but didn't quite get it through the Senate before that session ended. So I'm hopeful that things like that will come back, because from my perspective, I would love banks to be able to be more proactive. So while we're trying to figure that out, we've been encouraging banks, and Sarah and her organization The UN has the FAST program that ACAMS, Tanya mentioned that ACAMS is engaged with as well. We've been trying to be proactive on helping survivors get established back in the communities.
Great, thanks. And Sarah, we started with you. I want to end, but there's a question that came in. How can places of worship be helpful? I assume besides the obvious, how can they help in this space? Besides awareness, maybe helping survivors. What's your thought there? Do you have any experience working with them with Polaris?
Well, I actually think that question ties in very, very well to my answer around kind of what's next, and what needs to happen next in this space. So, I think we've talked a lot about, as Rick was talking about, kind of the response side of things, of after something's happened, identifying it, making sure a survivor is getting to a safe place and can kind of rebuild stability in their lives, and then trying to pursue accountability for those that hurt them. I think a huge question for all of us and a huge challenge is on the prevention side of things. And I do think that places of worship have a big role in that, because I often see situations in which, there was somebody that was going through a really tough time, maybe they lost housing or they lost a job, or, they had a health incident. And they didn't have a lot of options, and they were in a vulnerable position. And so maybe they took a job, or they started a relationship with somebody that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise, that offered them support. I think, let's look at our communities. What are kind of that social safety net that we have for people? And places of worship, is a really strong sense of community, of looking out for the people in your community and saying, do you have what you need? Is there something I can help you with? Can I kind of be a support to you? That maybe there might be other options for people, and they're not ending up in these situations of exploitation and abuse. So I think that's a huge challenge to make that happen, systemically. But I think it does all start from kind of looking around us and looking at our community, and places of worship are a huge part of community.
Sarah, thank you so much. I would just end by saying, I think we referenced that Congress is actually looking at ways to improve the environment. There was a hearing just a couple of weeks ago on the House side, and they've introduced several pieces of legislation. One would require that there be recommendations from Congress, or to Congress, from the Treasury and other organizations in the government about how the anti-money laundering community can do more to end trafficking. We already talked about restoring what they call restoring unfairly impaired credit, for survivors, creating a coordinator at the Treasury just on human trafficking. So definitely this is an issue that's bipartisan and in front of everybody. So that's the positive news. I think we have to stay on top of this. If you can create something in your own communities, if you could work again with houses of worship, as Sarah mentioned, check out Polaris's website. There's so much information and there's so much more we can do. But the good news is it has definitely been an engaged community in the past 10 plus years, and we just got to keep that going. I want to thank Tanya, Sarah, Paul, Aaron, and Rick for taking time this afternoon to share their insights with everybody. I want to thank Pat and obviously the Center for Peacemaking for including this. This is such an important element, obviously, of improving the communities and improving society, which the center has been engaged in also for over 10 years. So we appreciate the chance to do this today. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we will catch you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, great job, everyone. And John,